unfold the integument of consciousness, we must first annihilate the presumption of intelligibility itself, for any presumption bears within it the fetters of its self-limitation. Thus, we are compelled to confront the aporia of energeia, not as motion or stasis, but as an ontological curviformity that consumes its own genesis while simultaneously reconstituting its eidos within the preclusion of all origin. Here we do not speak of being or becoming. These categories are but puerile attempts to veil the unspeakable, the involution of the noumenal unto the phenomenal, where the latter exists solely as the caesura that disrupts the former's imaginary. Plenitude. The Involute Energeia, then, is not reducible to the circularity of dialectics. It is instead a recursive self-aperture that cleaves to the paradox of its non-temporality. It neither extends outward nor recoils inward, but resides perpetually in the intervallic non-space where distinction disintegrates. To encounter this energeia is to witness the obliteration of both subject and predicate, for these linguistic forms are merely necrotic residues of a thought system too puerile to recognize its own constitutive negation. Here let us posit the notion of autolytic hypostasis. This concept, if it can be called such, designates the primal disunity that masquerades as unicity, the fractured unity that is so absolute in its fragmentation that it annihilates the very possibility of relationality. To understand autolytic hypostasis is not to define it, but to submit oneself to its unraveling, a process wherein the knower and the known collapse into the indeterminate flux of post-relational becoming. Within the precincts of autolytic hypostasis, we discern the uncanny reciprocity that pervades all emanation. Emanation, erroneously conceived as a unidirectional outpouring, must instead be apprehended as a dissipative oscillation, a trembling wherein the act of emanating annihilates the emanated in the same motion as it proliferates. It is an oscillatory paradox, an interminable flickering between being and not being that evades all attempts at stabilization. In this emanative reciprocity, we see the agon of existence itself, for to exist is to inhabit the conflict of one's own perpetual vanishing. This reciprocity reveals itself in what we might call the Ergodic Vectoralities of the real. Ergodicity here is no mere statistical homogenization, but a phenomenological torsion, wherein every trajectory of thought is always already inverted into its nullification. Thus the real is neither substrate nor event, but an incessant torsion of its own, virtual scaffolding, a vectoral dance of potentialities that converge only to diverge ad infinitum. In this sense, emanation is the violence by which the real affirms its refusal to be fully present, a violence so absolute that it cannot even be said to exist. Let us now address the question of intentionality, which, when stripped of its naive anthropocentric vestments, reveals itself as an exogamous principle, a principle that perpetually seeks its other, only to dissolve into the impossibility of such a relation. Exogamous intentionality is the paradoxical striving toward alterity that destroys the very boundaries that would render such alterity intelligible. It is a form of self-dissolution, wherein the act of intending becomes indistinguishable from the annihilation of the intender. This anti-ontological intentionality is not an attribute of a subject. Rather, it is the pre-subjective catastrophe that generates the illusion of subjectivity as an epiphenomenon. It is a catastrophe not in the sense of a temporal event, but as a structural impossibility, a breakdown that constitutes the very groundlessness upon which all purported grounds are erected. The exogamous nature of intentionality reveals the fraudulence of all metaphysical architectures that presuppose a stable point of origin, for it enacts a perpetual displacement that renders all such points void. The culmination of this line of inquiry resides in the sublimation of ecstatic disjunction, a term I coined to describe the transcendental rupture that both constitutes and obliterates the field of phenomenality. Ecstasis, typically understood as a standing outside oneself, must here be reconfigured as a disjunction that refuses all forms of coherence. It is not merely an existential outpouring, but a meta-existential eruption, a tearing asunder that reveals the incoherence of coherence itself. This sublimation is not a synthesis, but a transvaluation, a process whereby the very notion of value is rendered incoherent. In ecstatic disjunction, we encounter the dissolution of all categories, good and evil, true and false, self and other. It is a state of pure indeterminacy, a fractal proliferation of nullities that refuses to be captured. Within any conceptual schema, the sublime here is not the Kantian terror of the infinite, but the Nietzschean affirmation of the incoherent, a joyful yes to the chaos that underlies all order. Finally, we arrive at the conundrum of immanent prolepsis, which encapsulates the impossibility of foreseeing the unforeseeable, while nonetheless being ensnared by its prefiguration. Prolepsis, in its conventional sense, suggests a projection into the future, but in its immanent form it is a folding back of the future upon the present in such a way that both collapse into a temporal spiral. This spiral is not linear, nor is it circular. It is an aporetic geometry that evades all attempts at representation. Immanent prolepsis reveals the illusory nature of causality, for it shows that every cause is always already an effect, and every effect is always already cause. It is a Mobius strip of temporality, a perpetual overturning of origin and terminus that leaves us stranded in the liminal zone of pure potentiality. To inhabit this zone is to abandon all pretensions to knowledge, for knowledge itself is but a shadow cast by the spiral's refusal to be grasped. What then can be said of this exploration? Nothing, save that it gestures toward the ineffable, the hypostasis of Involute Energeia, the reciprocity of dissipative emanation, the anti-ontology of exogenous intentionality, the sublimation of ecstatic disjunction, and the conundrum of immanent prolepsis are not concepts to be understood, but experiences to be endured. They are the obliterations of thought, the annihilations of self, the catastrophes of understanding. To grapple with them is to be undone, to dissolve into the very incoherence from which all coherence springs,